So today we talk about the 70s and 80s before we go into the last decades. And we talk about shocks, and we talk about affluence, and we talk about complacence. These are the three words of this lecture. Now, what are the shocks that I'm referring to? If you have done your reading, you would know. What shocks? Somebody. Happened in the 1970s to Japan. Yes?
Nixon shock.
Nixon shock and? Oil shock and?
Golden standard.
Gold shock. Or golden standard shock. So good. So three shocks in the early 70s. And then how Japan sort of managed to be successful in overcoming these shocks quite well. And how it became more and more wealthy while the other countries suffered from oil shock and global recession, but Japan managed to maintain steady growth. So affluence. Affluence means wealth, right? And not just in terms of being a strong export economy, Japan's sort of consumers became wealthier and able to buy more stuff. And of course there was a bubble starting in the 80s. So vis-a-vis other countries, there's a bit of tension. We talk about that. And complacence. What does complacence mean? What is complacent person? What's that? Somebody.
Smug.
Huh?
Smug.
Smug. What's smug? One difficult word replaced by another. What is complacent? Huh? Nobody? Yes, sir. Huh?
Like conformism?
Not conformism. Yes. Self-satisfied. That is, you're sort of no more trying hard. You're satisfied with the situation, and you become arrogant. Okay. And there's this in the textbook talks about it, an idea that Japan had been so successful that it started to become complacent. You know, politically, the LDP had become quite complacent because it kept on winning elections, and economically, it became world's second economy, and also able to compare with even the U.S., which was in a lot of trouble in the 80s, buying up property, buying up companies, and feeling like we're on top of the world. We are at the peak, and nobody can compete with us. And of course, we all know that this complacence eventually turned to collapse, right, in 1989, the bubble bursting. So we'll talk about these changes, and it's quite a different period from the one that we saw before, between the 50s and 70s, when there was a lot of growth and a lot of change, a lot of dynamism, and also a lot of political tensions. But in this period, it's settled. A lot of these political tensions are settled, at least on the surface, and you have stability, which leads to a sort of, there are tensions, but the stability makes things a bit complacent. Okay, so let's go through them. And I'll talk about the different things, the shocks, the conservative entrenchment, and how Japan was seen. All of this chapter, this lecture has to do with Japan's relations with the outside world. We haven't really talked about much about Japan's relation with the outside world in this class. But here, finally, Japan sort of becomes very, very, its presence is felt globally because it's now a really big economy and it's dominant, and there are tensions created. Until now, Japan was the little brother of the United States, right? And the Western powers, and everybody wanted to make sure that it was successful and stable because of the Cold War. But now Japan is becoming almost a threat to the West, especially after the Cold War ends. But even before that, you see a lot of tension between the U.S. and Japan, and with the rest of the West a little bit more. So questions you can ask: why was Japan able to avoid the recession and stagnation which struck the West after the oil crisis? Why was Japan, unlike other Western countries, able to recover so quickly? How did Japan's continuing economic success, even after this shock, it picks up, the economy picks up in 75, 76, continues, affect its economy, affect its politics and society, and its relation to the rest of the world? A more general question we can ask is, what are the dangers of success, or too much success, for a society? Can it sustain such a level of success over time? And Japan is probably a good case, where dramatic, miraculous growth, and then high growth, and then suddenly, boom, it starts to shrink. So a lot of the problems, for example, of depopulation, aging, low childbirth, problems with not, overly protective of domestic markets, overly protective of farmers, for example, all these kind of problems that we see today, lack of efficiency in certain sectors, a lot of them actually are kind of start to appear already in the 80s, and it lingers on to this day. Okay, so we'll talk about those. Okay, so the first shock is the Nixon shock, which you probably have studied before, and until, of course, 1971, the U.S. did not have any formal diplomatic relations with the PRC, the People's Republic of China, which was a communist country, and of course, during the Cold War, the U.S. had relations with Taiwan, and it saw Taiwan as a legitimate government. China, and it had informal, of course, contacts with Beijing, but until 1971, no real contacts, and Japan followed the lead of its main ally and protector, the U.S. So Japan also had relations with Taiwan, very little with China, although there were some groups within Japan that felt like we should also have close ties with China. 1971, a shock announcement to the world that Nixon is going to visit the U.S. No, Nixon is going to visit Beijing. And here we have Nixon, and I guess this is Zhou Enlai, the Prime Minister of China. He's practicing his chopsticks. And it came as a big surprise, and it came especially as a shock to the Japanese government because they were not informed ahead of time. Maybe they were told, I don't know, a day before or 6 hours before the announcement was made that this visit is going to take place. Nixon announces a surprise visit of the president, Nixon, to go to PRC. First Kissinger goes, and then to start to reopen diplomatic relations and to normalize relations without consultation or notice of the Japanese government. Of course, this was a great shock to the foreign ministry and the Japanese leadership, and also to the Japanese public. And it was a sense of betrayal. I thought we were the closest ally, and this is a very important issue for Japan in the region, and the U.S. is going ahead. And of course, it damaged bilateral relations, but more importantly, or I think psychologically, it created this sense that, Japan could be abandoned. We talked about abandonment and entrapment. Abandoned and entrapped. There's two sides of the coin for a small country that's allied to a big country. And this idea that U.S. could, the big ally, the bigger partner, could suddenly decide to change policy overnight without telling the smaller partner, stoked fears of betrayal, of abandonment. Who knows what could happen if they're not going to consult with us? So this was a serious damage to bilateral relations. And so Japan turns towards Asia, and Japan becomes more proactive in various ways to, not just to reach out to China, to communist China, but also to other Asian countries, and to not just follow the U.S. lead in terms of foreign policy, at least regionally. This is Mao Zedong and Tanaka Kakue, one of the Japanese prime ministers at the time. And Japan restores ties with the PRC even earlier than the US. The US takes a bit longer to normalize relations. They also deepen ties with other Asian countries, South Korea, Southeast Asia. Well, this is, of course, even before the Nixon shock, but it accelerates. And they deepen economic ties to these Asian states, accelerates in order to create allies within the region, and not just to depend on the US. Okay, and they do this a lot of it relating to loans, low interest loans, or even aid, ODA, throughout Asia. Some other facts like the first Asian meeting with Japan took place in Malaysia and Kuala Lumpur in 1977. So all these kind of regional links and regional ties begin around this time, turning towards Asia. ODA, as I said, a lot of it is going to Asian neighbors. And this you can understand as this notion that Japan needs to have multiple allies in the region. It can't just depend on the US, because the US is unpredictable, as Nixon showed. Although these kind of links and forging ties to Asian nations take place, there's also still, even at this time, or already in this time, wartime tensions from war responsibility. It's talked about a lot since the 2000s, but even in the 70s, you have even riots, which you don't hear about nowadays, but in Bangkok and Jakarta, Thailand, and Indonesia, when Japanese companies started to invest into Southeast Asia, there was a sense that, oh, this is a return of Japanese imperialism and colonialism. So there are riots, which is not quite known, but not, major riots against Japanese businesses. In 1978, a very important thing that happened is this Class A war criminals, those who are seen as the most responsible for Japan's war of aggression. Some of them, of course, were tried, or all of them were tried, some executed, some died in prison. Those that died or executed, they are enshrined. 14 souls are enshrined in the Yasukuni Shrine in 1978. Why this timing? It's not quite clear. What takes place in 1978. And this, of course, until this day, Yasukuni is a major point of contention, right? If you know the recent news, recent 10 years, 15 years, whenever a prime minister or minister of Japan goes to Yasukuni to show respect to the war dead, it includes 14 Class A war criminals. And the Shinto priests in Yasukuni, they secretly enshrined 14. So this is a source of today's tensions here. After this enshrinement, of course, Prime Minister had gone, but Nakasone took an official visit in 1985. This triggered a lot of tension, and after that, there has not been official visits until Koizumi. But already these kind of wartime issues emerged, not in the 60s, not in the 70s, but starting around the 80s. Yeah, another tension with Japan and its neighbors, former colonies, is the textbooks used in, I think, junior high school. And there was a revision. They changed the content of the textbook a little bit in 1982, and changing the language. It was Chugoku no Shinryaku became Shinko. So invasion became incursion. The word Shinko is a bit less aggressive and violent than Shinryaku. They changed the words, and what happened? Of course, there's a lot of protest all over. Within Japan, from the left, those who are opposed to militarism, who are afraid of Japan returning to its militarized past, but also, of course, from its Asian neighbors. Textbook issue emerges again in 2000, 2002. It's a lingering problem, and that it hasn't been resolved. What I'm trying to point out is all these things that tensions emerge around this time, it continues throughout to this day without being solved. You can ask why? Why is it taking for so long? Well, for different reasons, but it's not new, these challenges for Japan and its neighbors. Now we switch to another shock, and this is more in terms of economic tensions. Until 1971, the US had fixed currency exchange rates. The dollar was fixed to the yen, and it was tied to the gold standard. And this was suddenly announced that in August of 1971, after the Nixon shock, going to Beijing, that we are no longer going to fix the dollar to the yen at 360 yen a dollar. So the yen can fluctuate. And you can see in this graph, all through 1950 to 1971, $1, 360 yen, which means that the dollar is very expensive and the yen is very cheap, right? It helps to exporters, it helps Japanese companies if the yen is fixed at this very cheap level. After this, of course, you see the yen getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And the DPJ, Minshuto Jidai, became almost 75 yen. So now it's about 110 yen, 115 yen. Anyhow, part of the reason for this gold shock was that Japan's economy was getting stronger and stronger, and it was exporting more and more to the US. And there's an increasing trade deficit for the US. The US is importing much more than it's exporting to Japan, which causes tensions, and a lot of the US manufacturers, shipbuilders, steel, textile companies, plastics, they felt the unfair advantage. The Japanese had an unfair advantage because their yen is so cheap, they can export more. So these were pressures on administration. By getting off the gold standard by fluctuating currency, the yen became, as we see, more expensive, or the dollar became cheaper, which means the US companies and manufacturers can export that more effectively or have a greater chance. So this is kind of tensions, trade tensions with US and Japan were already emerging because Japan is getting more bigger and stronger and wealthier and more competitive. So this is a reaction. It makes Japan's exports more expensive. Even still, Japanese companies manage to sustain these shocks, as I'll talk about later, even despite this challenge of suddenly their yen becoming, I don't know, in a few years' time almost. By 1980 it was 200 yen, 180 yen. It gets lower. They still maintain competitive advantage despite this weakening of the dollar, strengthening the yen. And in the book we have all these examples of US-Japan trade tensions which emerge around this period because Japan is becoming wealthier and more competitive. And US accuses Japan of so-called dumping. That is, it's selling its products much cheaper than it costs to make them. Cars, ships, steel, even color TVs, automobiles. And in the 80s, early 80s, all these spats, trade spats between Japan and US. US government says, you guys are not fair, you guys are selling it too cheap, you're exporting too much, you should import more American stuff. And then the Japanese government says, okay, we will voluntarily reduce our exports, okay? And we will restrict exports, and we'll try and import more. So you see this kind of protectionism that you see under the Trump administration, similar kind of situation. In the 80s, you had Rust Belt emerging in the US. We talk about now a lot of this Midwest, where would be the Rust Belt? All these industrial areas, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Detroit, obviously. And this kind of problem of manufacturing areas and blue-collar jobs being lost in the U.S. and a lot of tension and anti-foreign, anti-Japanese sentiment, especially directed to Japan. Now it's directed to China mainly, because China is a major exporter. You see it. And this picture, dramatic, is the Union of Automotive Workers, or United Auto Workers. So it's the labor union for the American car company, and they're smashing, what is this? A Toyota Corolla with pipes and whatever, to show they're angry at Japanese car makers because they can't compete. They feel like they have an unfair advantage. So this kind of background tensions emerging. So Japan is turning into not just a partner and ally and Cold War ally, but actually a menace, a threat. Tensions. Okay. How did the Japanese economy respond to this dollar shock and protectionism? Well, they managed to reduce costs, make themselves more efficient, the manufacturing sector in Japan. And of course, because there was a stronger yen, this meant that imports of raw materials is cheaper. So that sort of counterbalanced the fact that their exports are becoming more expensive. So input becomes cheaper, although of course their product is relatively more expensive. They also Japanese companies start to invest outside of Japan, especially in markets that are important for them, to avoid protectionism. So if the US is going to put up tariffs and make it difficult for Japanese companies to export, it's politically difficult, then you build your factory in the US, or you build your factory in Europe, then you're domestically producing. So you see this shift. This is just a chart showing how manufacturing sector has increased this overseas production. And I don't know, car companies like Toyota, or I don't know, all kinds of car part makers, well, I don't know, all sorts of companies moved. They had their production site in Japan, but they also started producing in these markets that they were concerned with to avoid. So this integrates economies together. Okay. This is to show that even though these shocks occurred, the trade deficit, that is Japan's exports to the US, continued. It was not enough to stop this increase of Japanese exports. This is minus in billions of US dollars. So this is US trade deficit. So this is the amount of exports to US net compared to the imports. And so you see very, very sharp, continue to be export deficit for the US. So although there are all these tensions and all this infighting, trade tensions and spats, it hasn't really helped overall. Okay, the final shock after the gold shock and Nixon shock is the oil shock, which we sort of mentioned in terms of why we break up the period, our periods from 1955 to 72, because oil shock comes in 73. And this is a global event. It doesn't affect just Japan. What it does is it puts a stop to this miraculous economic growth that a lot of the Western countries have been experiencing. It's not just because you need cheap oil to grow, it sends a shock to the system around the world. Why? What happened? Well, there's this thing called the Yom Kippur War, Israel versus Egypt and Syria, and the OECD countries, mainly the Middle Eastern countries, OPEC countries, not OECD, OPEC countries, say that if you're siding against Egypt and Syria during this war, we will not export oil to you. And overnight this happened. Oil prices quadruple. Quadruple is what? What is it? Quadrupling. Doubling is 2, tripling is 3, quadruple is 4. I don't know what 5 times is. Who knows what 5 times is? Pentupling or something. No big deal. So it soars. Can you imagine? Electricity prices, oil prices, electricity generated from oil suddenly goes up 4 times. The impact on all kinds of economic activity. There's a slowdown of the economy. There's a shortage of goods produced, so people go to the supermarket or store and they can't get a lot of things because the production has stopped because oil is so expensive. And as a raw material, you need oil, and you need oil to have merchant marine to export, import stuff. So there are like things like toilet paper. There's not enough toilet paper. Everybody's hoarding toilet paper or hoarding children's diapers. Apparently at this time, everybody went to the store and bought up all of them. Can you imagine what an unpleasant thing it is to be a shortage of toilet paper? Anyway, that was one of the minor problems at that time. Inflation. Because of very high oil prices, all these consumer products increase 25% in 1 year. That's almost hyperinflation. And then GDP shrinks for the first time since 1950 something. It's a big shock. Higher oil prices have a large impact on not just consumers, but of course producers that use a lot of electricity. For example, aluminum. You need a lot of electricity to make aluminum, and if you don't, and to make electricity, you need oil. And so aluminum producers went out of business, or it was very difficult. Various things. Oil tankers. Japanese were great shipbuilders at the time. Because there's not enough oil, you don't need as many oil shipments. So for at least a short time, there were fewer and fewer tankers being built. All kinds of effects, expected and unexpected. Well, this is just a chart we saw. Low price, boom. Oil shock. Well, 2 oil shocks. There's one in 1971, another one in 1976 and 77. It has come down again. How did they respond? How did the Japanese company respond? Well, they had plans to reduce dependence on oil, especially from the Middle East, and to shift to other energy sources, particularly nuclear power and hydro dam power. Those they already had nuclear power program in Japan, but this expanded and accelerated as a result of the oil shock, because Japan depends so much on imports. Okay? And Japan has a lot of hydropower because there's dams everywhere. Or we can build dams in a lot of places. Japan mountainous, lots of rivers. And of course, all the industries made a lot of effort to make their manufacturing processes highly energy efficient. So I don't know, there's charts showing how Japanese energy efficiency and production efficiency surged after 71, 76 to respond to this kind of higher input cost. There was also industrial restructuring, so downsizing. book talks a little bit about it. Through orderly and planned reduction of workforce size. We're not hiring more people. Gently recommending voluntary retirement. So a lot of industries, shipbuilding, for example, steel, they cut employment. But they did it in a way that didn't create the kind of social tension, political tension that you saw in, say, the Rust Belt in the U.S. or the coal mining areas in northern England. Around this time, what's happening in the U.K. and U.S., for example, is a lot of political tension because of stagflation, because of downsizing, because of a shift in the industry. You have 1980s famous for riots, coal mining strikes, coal miners striking in northern England, US too, all kinds of tensions. Okay, and there's a shift from industry that depends on raw materials and large-scale building to more like assembly and more added value. So electronics and car making are the key industries that really start to accelerate here. Government encourages a shift away from things that require a lot of material and is energy intensive to more high-tech and more assembly. Okay. So, and Japan's successful at doing this transition. And one could probably do a study as to why Japan was so much more successful than the other countries, or was able to withstand the shocks better. We'll talk about that a little bit in the book. So we'll go on now to how they recover. Well, as I said, by the 80s, now these big industries like shipbuilding, steel a little bit, petrochemical, plastics, textiles, they sort of shrank and were replaced by automotive and electro manufacturing. So 14 out of 25 Japan's largest firms were in these two industries. Okay? By 1980, Japan was the largest automaker in the world, if you combine all the car production. This is quite impressive. So minor things like Kaizen and quality control, these sort of management terms that are very popular have been discussed. These are developed around this time in Japan, improving efficiency. And this is seen to be possible because Japan had a kind of flat or cooperative relationship between management and labor. We talked a little bit about the strikes and the union activity in the 50s and 60s, but it was resolved in the mid-60s to a cooperative relationship, especially for the major firms and the permanent workers. And so this is seen as a permanent employment. The company will promise not to fire people, and then the unions will moderate their demands for increased salaries or for, controlling the workplace. They would come to a compromise. And this helped, or seemed to have helped, to make Japanese companies more efficient in manufacturing processes. Then you have emergence of new sectors, financial sectors, service sectors, retail, education and entertainment, urban kind of industries, increasing shift to from secondary to tertiary sector. And to serve a wealthier, affluent middle class who had more spending power, who wanted to buy stuff, buy services in the cities, okay? And this is changing the structure of Japanese economy. It's not just export-oriented, it's becoming more and more service and domestic-oriented. Overall, then, what does it do? It means that Japan's economy is growing, even in the 1970s. To 1990, Japan is this 10 cent here. 0, 10%. So it drops from 10% to about 5%, 4 to 3%. 4 to 3%. Look, EU and US, much weaker. Until about 1995, actually. Japanese economic performance is better than EU and US. About 1995, we'll talk about that starting next week. Japan enters lost decades, stagnation, and recession. Low-key recession for 20 years. And you have low unemployment rates. As I said, there was a kind of cooperative agreement made between management and labor, and even the big companies that were suffering under the oil shocks, they didn't lay off workers immediately. It was very difficult to fire them. They kept them on, or they transferred them to subsidiaries and new projects. So this created social stability. Whereas in the US, UK, and Europe, in the mid-70s and 80s, 10%, 8% unemployment rates, even more. This, of course, is a source of political turmoil. Well, one of the reasons why Japan doesn't have a Le Pen or doesn't have a Trump is that, part of it is that there's not so many young people who are pissed off. Or not enough young people, they may be pissed off. But the unemployment rates in Japan are low, 3 to 4%, even today. The quality of employment is not very good in Japan. Work-life balance is terrible, but people are busy and employed. Of course, the other difference is immigration. Japan has such low immigration that you don't get Le Pen and Trump kind of situation. But that's for later. Okay. So Japan is doing so well, the other countries are struggling. So what happens is other countries are both concerned and want Japan to take more leadership and to contribute more, and Japan feels like it's should take a leadership role as well as a central role among the OECD economies, among the G5. I sort of jumped, but in 1985 you have very important development in that Japan agrees to help other countries and their exports by strengthening the yen and encouraging domestic consumption. So investment within Japan, so that other countries can export stuff to Japan and stimulate the global economy. And so they have what is called the Plaza Accord, which takes place in the Plaza Hotel in New York City. This is not the Plaza Hotel, this is Rockefeller. And Japanese MOF, what's MOF? Good. So MOF. They say, okay, we will reduce interest rates, which will encourage borrowing in Japan. We also try to steer the yen to become even stronger. It was about 150 yen or whatever, now down to 100 yen. And we will expand government spending domestically so that, there'll be more consumption soaked up within the country. What happens if you have easy money, if you lower interest rates dramatically, and there's a lot of money floating around, there's a lot of money that can be poured into things, poured into investments for companies and for domestic consumption, but a lot of the extra goes into real estate, right? And so there's what is called a real estate bubble, asset inflation. So a lot of land gets, speculation, land prices just start soaring. In addition, you have a lot of companies with extra money, because it's so easy to borrow money and they're doing so successfully exporting. They start buying things outside of Japan. They buy such things as the Rockefeller Center. Mitsubishi buys Rockefeller Center. Sony buys Columbia Pictures. I don't know who bought Pebble Beach, Mitsui or something, I don't know. Paintings too, they buy very fancy Van Gogh and Renoir and French Impressionist paintings at tremendous prices, $50 million, $5 million, $10 million, I don't know. Incredible prices. So much money. So they buy a property, art, bonds. They buy a lot of treasury bonds in the US. So Japan is buying everything. Okay? And of course, this causes tension. Right? It's almost like China today. China is buying a lot of property, a lot of companies snapping up companies, and this is causing fear within the countries. We're taken over by the Chinese. Same thing. We're going to be taken over by the Japanese. Yeah, sort of the yellow peril. Right. Here you can see, this is the Nikkei stock average. This is part of the bubble period, the affluence. 1970s to about 85, Plaza Accord. It's about 5,000 to 10, 15,000. Boom, shoots up. Not only is there a real estate asset inflation bubble, there's a bubble in the stock market. Shoots up. In just a matter of 3 years, or 4 years since 1985, you have the value of the stock market doubling, right? More than doubling. Peak of like 39,000. What's the stock market average now? Okay, 225. Who knows? Nobody knows Nikkei Heikin? Really? Nobody's doing stock market trading in this class? What do you do in your spare time? I'm joking. I think it's probably like 17 or 18,000. Anyway, it's much lower than at this peak period, which is quite rare. Most stock markets gradually go up. Japan has gone down. Anyway, at the peak, the Tokyo Stock Exchange value, the value of the companies, the valuation, was 40% of all listed companies in the world. All real estate in Tokyo, you could buy all of US. If you sold the Imperial Palace, not that you can sell the Imperial Palace, the value of the land there, if you assess it by Ginza prices, you could buy all of California. So some craziness at that time. So what this leads to our next discussion of confidence and complacency. That is, Japan was successful in riding out these three shocks, and it has become too confident and too complacent, or becomes confident. Some would argue that the country and its leadership becomes complacent as to mounting problems, structural problems. This is how Japan was viewed outside of Japan, mainly by American observers, or Europeans. So this is Ezra Vogel's book. I think this is 1978 or 9, maybe a bit later. And the book is called Japan as Number One. Lessons for America. America is doing very poorly, and now we have to learn from them, especially their economic practices and business practices, management practices, but also in general how society is run, how it's orderly, harmonious, how everybody seems to be working so hard and trust each other. And the U.S., all kinds of internal conflicts and struggle and problems, social problems. Japanese as a model. So there's an admiration, but there's also a fear of Japan. That Japan is kind of invading and taking over. So some of the movies, if you go back to Hollywood movies in the 1970s, well, 80s, early 80s, Hollywood movies, Japan is depicted usually as this threat. What was the film? I can't remember the name of the film. Actors' faces come up. Sort of mysterious connection between Japanese corporations and Yakuza and past military links. And they use their money and muscle into American companies and take over. Kind of a fantasy fiction world. But you see some of the Hollywood movies made in the 80s about Japan. And it's very different from how Japan is depicted today. Japan is a menace. Within Japan, you have, because of this great success, this explosion of so-called Nihonjinron, literature about explaining Japan to the Japanese. Okay, we still have this, but probably not as dramatic and as positive. Now the Nihonjinron often tends to be very negative, or maybe more balanced, I don't know. But there's all these theories explaining why is Japan so successful, and it's cultural theories. Okay? We'll talk a little bit about culture, but the fact that Japanese culture is unique, that people have very group-oriented and cohesive. There's a lot of emphasis on gama and gambari and work ethic and loyalty, employee loyalty, and avoiding conflict. Okay? So a lot of this stuff is very non-scientific. Most of it's non-scientific and bunk, but it shows the state of the nation, maybe more generally. And then assertiveness of Japanese conservatism sort of suggested, because they're so successful, so wealthy, they see that other countries have problems. And Japan asserts itself and looks down at other countries. There are some ministers, a minister, I don't remember who he was exactly, but who said that American workers are lazy and ignorant and illiterate, and that's why you have a problem. You should be like us and train your workers to be hardworking and more literate. It became, of course, a major problem. Shintaro Ishihara wrote a book Japan that can say no to it anymore. So this new conservative phenomenon, at least probably it was internal, but now it's coming out. Japan is equal to the West and should be able to say no. Not even equal, maybe more equal than the West. You're not going to be pushed around. We're not going to be just a smaller partner or ally. And here we start having discussions of, is Japan a small nation or a big nation? Should it be a medium nation? Whatever that means. And the idea that, we need to change the constitution, we need to restore Japan's strength and independence. It starts to fire up again around this time. Although they had that already from the end of the war, of course, but now the catching up period is over. We're no longer catching up, now we want to go our own way. And then at the same time, there's a lot of doubts and concerns in Japanese society. So this is maybe not the best picture, but this is Juliana Tokyo, which is a Roppongi disco club, which was a boom during the bubble period. Everybody had tons of money to burn, and everybody went partying all night long. And this was a concern. Was this a good thing, right? Consumerism, materialism, selfish, apolitical kind of culture emerging among the young people and older people. There's too much money and people are getting corrupt. People are losing their traditional values, family values, work values. Youth are lacking work ethic that had built post-war Japan. Always this kind of argument. Right? Young people are too lazy, or young people are not. They don't come on enough. This term Shinjindu came about in the 80s. At the same time, the reverse side of the coin is that the Japanese are working too much. There's a data in the textbook which says that Japanese employers were working 10% more than Americans and 30% more than Europeans in time. I think this is probably the same today. Question is, are they efficient? What are they really doing in terms of the hours spent? But people begin to doubt this GDP Shijo Shugi, so always pushing for growth. Much more strongly now that you reach the top, basically. When you're catching up, maybe you have still more to go, but once you start to become one of the strongest economies, you start to question, is this worth it? People in the book, they talk about people complaining about very cramped living conditions, small houses, long commuting distances, with being squeezed into trains, and people start, because they travel, people traveling more overseas, they question this Japanese economic model. We're rich by numbers, but in real life, is our life rich? I think we can still say this today, although Japan is by numbers, GDP per capita, GDP is no longer particularly rich. Okay, and as I said, this is a period not just of confidence and complacence, but mounting structural problems that we see today. What am I talking about? Big one is demographics. What is demographics? What's demo? People. Graphics is the study of. Geography is the study of land. What's another one? Biography is the study of life. Demographic study of people. So population, movement of population. 人口動態学, I guess. Okay, so already by 1989, you have the lowest level of infant mortality. So the chance of dying as a baby is very low in Japan, and also the chance of living very long in Japan. Their life expectancy is very high. It reaches one of the highest levels already by 1977. Since 1974, birth rates dropped steadily. And by 1974, the birth rate, that is the average number of children made, go below the replacement rate already in 1974, 2.1. So everybody should be worried about this demographic collapse, but it's talked about today. But the problem started 45 years ago. No, 43 years ago. Not started, but it was already evident in terms of the demographic problems. Then you also have a problem with Well, one of the main reasons driving this low birth rate is that women are more educated, women have more opportunity to work, and they want to work, and it's encouraged, but the government and the system doesn't provide infrastructure so that you can work and have a family. Balance. And that didn't exist. So there's limited support for child raising, and then there's limited support for caring for older people, which is another thing that is traditionally expected of women, of wives. Take care of children, take care of the old brothers. If you don't have a system to support that, if you don't have a public sector to support it, like Oikuen or old age homes, which everybody can access, even if they have money, women will choose career or family. A lot of them chose career. And so this starts in the 70s and accelerates. And so Japan starts entering an old age society. Welfare costs continue to grow, but not enough. A lot of the money is spent for old pensions, but not enough for providing the kind of care needed to enable women to have life and family and a work career. This is a chart that shows the birth rate. Okay. 1947, it was 4.32 children, fertility rate, total fertility rate. Should say it goes down dramatically. Already by 1955, it's, I don't know, near 2. It's stable throughout the 50s, and by 74, it dips down. If you don't have more than 2.1 children, I guess, 2 point something, then the population starts shrinking. It's a replacement rate. And you need a little bit more than 2. Because obviously you need 2 people to have a baby, yeah? And then you need 2 babies to mix in and make the population stable. This keeps on going down. Okay? 1.25. We picked up a little bit. We'll talk about it a bit more in detail. But number of babies born, fertility rate goes down. You also have a very strange situation in 1966 where it dips. Anybody know why it goes down like this? Fertility rate. It's called a hino e uma doshi. Anybody know? No? You heard of it? Apparently, if you are born as a girl in this year, it's very bad luck. So a lot of parents thought, I don't know if it's going to be a girl or a boy, but I don't want bad luck for my baby. So they didn't make children. Amazing, right? So this is culture impacting global economy. It goes down, but it picks up. Okay. Well, quality of life issues I already talked about. Overcrowding, juken, jigoku. 2 very bad things about Japan. It's there already. People are complaining about it in the 70s and 80s. And also the book highlights that, in the previous chapters it was talking about how all the Japanese have become, many of them think of themselves as churyu. Everybody's equal. Churyu lifestyle. But from around the 80s, you start seeing this divergence. Some people get access to university education, get access to cram school. Because of a competitive situation, those with more money can go to the better universities. Okay? And you start seeing this divergence between social divergence. And partly, of course, you have a divergence or gap between those who have land and who don't have land. And of course, there's always been a gap. If you own property, you don't are renting. But because the property prices shoot up, it's very difficult if you don't start out with some land to get into the market. You have to make a loan of several tens of millions of yen, 30-year loan, 50-year loan, 100-year loan. So when you have a property bubble, it strengthens or it solidifies the gap between those who own land and those who don't own land. You see this all over the world now. This is Piketty's argument, right? Pretends that if you own capital, if you own property, assets, those become richer and richer. And those who don't own your increase in wages doesn't catch up. It's not as rapid as the increase in capitalism property. We've seen this in Japan in the 80s. We also see the tension between rural and urban areas continuing. You have Kasoka and Kamitsuka, and the cities become more crowded, the rural areas become more depopulated. So lots of tensions, lots of problems, although very wealthy. So Japan is the wealthiest country in the world, they're buying up all these things, but these domestic problems are not being dealt with. Governments are not spending money on dealing with these problems. Okay? And this is, of course, lingers on, and we have this situation today still. Rural decline, we'll talk about this a bit more. Tanaka Kake, this is the very famous book in 1960 something, I remember 62, 63. The argument was, let's make Japan wealthy across the country, right? By building dams and bridges and moving factories and companies outside of Tokyo, outside of Osaka, into the countryside. They do that, and the government does a lot of those policies, but they're not enough, and they're not effective. Okay, partly because Japan's economy is globalization. So even if you can build your factory in Nagano or in Miyake or I don't know, Kagoshima, it's cheaper to go, more effective to have a factory outside. So you're having this rural economies weakening. These infrastructure project investments are not really creating self-sustaining economy. Agricultural sector is weakening. Redistribution through investment in public works, but it's not enough. It's not enough to keep the population staying. Cities are much more attractive, so you're seeing continued influx into the big cities. Tokyo and Osaka, maybe Fukuoka a little bit, and Nagoya. And local governments, local communities increasingly in debt to the central government. So another issue emerging at this time and not resolved, 1970s and 80s. Although there's a lot of money to be used to resolve it, it's questionable whether it's enough to have money to fix this gap. Okay, so that's kind of problems underneath the surface of this extremely, supposedly successful and wealthy economy. Do we have enough time? Yeah, we have 10 minutes. Good. At the end, I want to just quickly go over the political situation. What's happening to the government, the LDP, and the opposition party. Okay. So LDP system essentially very stable, it's stabilized. You have this very successful model of winning elections by favoring rural areas, public works, by favoring certain industries, by favoring certain groups through redistribution, through pork barrel, and also through legislation that protects them, and they keep on winning elections. And a kind of very strong relationship between politicians and bureaucrats and these protected groups. So LDP very stable, generally speaking, from the mid-70s to end of the 90s, end of the 80s. Yeah. So what you have instead is a lot of infighting within the LDP, increased factionalism, which the book talks about. And despite threats to split the party among these conservative factions, they managed to unite and unify and avoid breaking up. And of course, we talked about why LDP was so successful, but largely because the economy is growing, they've been managing to redistribute wealth, big business donations come into the party. So things seem to be relatively stable. Another example or another measure, an indicator of why it's so stable. By 1980, these are mostly LDP, but some socialists and even maybe some communists had their LDCs. Out of the 520 representatives in the lower house, almost a third of them were hereditary, Nisei Sansei Gi. This suggests a very, very stable system. That political power is within a limited elite. There isn't much circulation. Yet, of course, beneath this stability, there's underlying problems. And one of them is the kind of corruption scandals that come when there's too cozy relations with business and bureaucracy and the ruling party. Because they have very little, they have never been kicked out of power, and because there's little threat from the opposition, all kinds of corruption cases emerge. Tanaka Kakue, of course, famous for the Lockheed scandal involving the U.S. Airplane company, engines company. He was seen to have taken bribes from foreign companies, but also from construction companies. He was arrested. But even under arrest, he wins elections, which is quite shocking to anybody who thinks democracy is about accountability. But the voters were not concerned. The kind of corruption was seen as necessary corruption, structural corruption, so long as Tanaka-san brings projects to Niigata, so long as he does his job, a little bit of money. Politics is dirty, and there's an understanding that it's dirty, so long as economy is growing and employment is satisfying. Other scandals, the group scandal, South Cuban scandal, which spreads not just to select individuals, but kind of among ministers, even the prime minister, top bureaucrats are implicated. By this time, these scandals really hit the LDP, and part of the reason why they lose in 1993 are this. But this is where I'm getting ahead of myself. There's also kind of a neat drive to reform, not just the LDP internally, but to change this cozy relationship between bureaucracy and business and deregulate the economy a bit more, to reduce the size of the government. And this is sort of privatization, deregulation, the kind of things we hear about from Koizumi. It starts in Nakasone time. So this is a bit different from the beginning group of LDP, but kind of disconnecting from the traditional ties with business and bureaucracy we start seeing here. And of course, within the party, there's a lot of reformers, young reformers, such as Ozawa Ichiro, which we hear about today. They started emerging and saying, we can't keep on like this. LDP has too many problems, too many factions, too much corruption, too much money spent on elections. We need to change the system. And not only that, he says, well, LDP cannot provide leadership because of these internal problems. So you see internal push to change. Although the LDP keeps on winning. So winning elections, being stable on the surface doesn't mean that there are tensions generated from below. And generally speaking, around this time, a phrase used to describe Japan is that it has third-rate politics, but first-rate economy. That is, economy is very successful, it's very wealthy, it's very capable exporters. Politicians, well, they're kind of corrupt and they're not very charismatic, whatnot. But people didn't need that. People didn't expect that. They felt that the bureaucrats will lead Japan. You don't have to worry about the third-rate politicians. But of course, this eventually takes its toll. How about the opposition? Well, opposition continues. The Socialist Party continues to focus on constitution, focus on ideology. They don't have a very attractive or practical program to reform Japan politically, economically. But you still see some kind of votes moving towards the opposition because of scandals, especially in the urban areas. Urban areas have always been weak. LDP has been relatively weak. But you see growing support for the Socialist Party, and especially scandals feed into it. So, for example, the Doi Takako, who was I don't know if you've heard of this. She's supposed to be Madonna. I'm not sure if she looks like a Madonna, but anyhow, she's a Madonna senpu. She comes on the wind of all this opposition scandals, and people are sick and tired of the LDP, maybe a bit like 2009. And even if the socialists don't have they don't seem like they'll be so effective because they've never been in power. They don't have a very clear agenda, but let's vote to punish the LDP. So in 1989, they beat the LDP in the upper house, not the lower house. Okay. So there was a bit of a boom. So they're almost there. It takes a bit more. 1993, the LDP is pushed out. LDP is pushed out because it splits. Mainly, that's the only reason. It's not just the opposition. It splits, and the opposition, the LDP doesn't have enough for a majority. So you can see here, continually, that this is the Socialist Party. This is the LDP. LDP vote support rate in the public. It goes down in the 70s, but mid-70s it goes back up. And until at least 1999, relatively high, 40 to 50%. Whereas the socialists continue to decline, just to pick up 1989, Deutsche boom, and all the scandals, the crucial scandals. And then continue to decline. Here the LDP loses in 1993. But it's not because the socialists are so popular. It's because the LDP splits. So LDP oversees this period of affluence, uneasy stability. They're stable, they keep on winning elections, but they're not necessarily more popular than in the past, and they have internal problems and internal dissatisfaction, which explodes and causes 20 years of political turmoil, or not explodes, but it leads to political turmoil between 1990 and 2012, I would say. Okay. So, that's the end, that's the last slide. We have 7 minutes. So, was there anything that you wanted to ask in terms of this period? There's a lot of ideas, a lot of details. But it's necessary to get the full picture, or relatively full picture. Is there anything that I missed or you wanted to know more about in your textbook? No? Okay. Do your readings, okay? Next week is the next chapter, I think. Let's see. Chapter 17, page 308 to 322. Don't worry about this presentation question. This is for a different class. We will go into the last decade, so the 1990s. Now, if you want to borrow this book, I have 2 copies. I also have to get the book back from Shin Yue, Rusaldo, and Eriko Chagen. Yeah? If you know who you are, if you have the book, bring it back. Alright? I have your email, so I will track you down if you don't give me it. If you want to borrow, come up. It's first come, first served. Okay? So, see you next week. Thank you. You are